Let's come back to how we began this morning. Establishing what early 21st century astrophysics, subatomic physics, 21st century science is understanding for some while. When the quanta was recognized in the late 1890s, 1897, the 19th century had progressively dematerialized its scientific understanding of the world and of the universe. When you began in 1800, you had a very solid, graspable, conquerable world, best personified in all of its garish grandeur as Napoleon. And progressively, as the 19th century wore on, and the development of science began to go not just by leaps and bounds, but by a dynamic that sped up and accumulated. So that by the mid-1890s, the fraying of the conviction that there was a big picture, that there was an empire, that there was this world that is understandable, began to fray. In English terms, it moved from the Victorian Empire to the Edwardian mysteriousness of London, the London of Sherlock Holmes. And quickly, quote, devolved from that into World War I. And any shred of the old was granulated. And all of the attempts since then have been people taking sawdust and adding glue to make chipboard. There is no civilization. Coming to the fore, increasingly during the 20th century, were peoples marginalized previously, not just left out, but dismissed. Two of the very large populations are people of color and people of gender. So it's not surprising at all that having found that chipboard doesn't build to last anyway, that the recognition that all of this is more fragile than a house of cards, two black women in India exemplify the tremendous understanding of recalibration that has happened and has yet to come into recognition even among those who make their living as professional academics. One of them we have talked about extensively, and her name, Malati Shengi. She goes with the initial J, Malati J. Shengi. Her great book is The Civilized Demons, the Harappans in Rig Veda, and her investigations of the Indus civilization, Harappa, and of Mohenjo-Daro, and the whole spread of it. And the fact that in the Rig Veda, it seems to be crushed to dismissal by an Aryan invasion of whites who have powerful cohesion and come into play and reshape everything, and that what is set up then is the India that we know, the India of Kipling. The big problem for Kipling's India was the big game between Russia, China, and England. Now transposed to Russia, China, and America, with British and Commonwealth and European and so forth. Most of them have never read Kipling. They don't understand that Kipling ended the sham of the great game in his great book that ended the empire, that ended the whole Kipling-esque illusion, and that book is Kim. He wrote it after he left India, was not yet in England. He wrote it in Vermont. Not far from where the Green Mountain Boys used to hold up after the American Revolution. Kim does not play in the great game that he was trained to do. He found his Lama, his Tibetan Lama, who was able to mature him, to bring him out of the great game, bring him out of being a little dark brown boy from India to realizing that one can rise above the illusion. All of it. All of them. The end of Kim realizes that the arrow that is shot from the bow of the archer who understood that Vajrayana has fallen into a special hidden river, and that if one can find and immerse oneself in that rhythm, that river, that whole rhythm of deception shows itself to be a mechanical, cardboard, false impersonation of a dance. And one is delivered into the dance of the real. And the end of Kim, if you will read it, says that that is what occurred for Kim. Malati shows that the Indus civilization, those black Indians of the Indus civilization indigenous to India, indigenous by going back as far back as the Paleolithic goes and even farther, had a marvelous civilization, had tremendous trading on a massive scale with the Mesopotamia of Sargon of Akkad 4,400 years ago. And there are two great urban centers with subsidiary urban centers, cities. Hundreds of thousands of people in Mohenjo-Daro or Harappa and many other smaller and yet sizable cities. In Harappa, the granaries were so enormous and huge that you had dozens and dozens of granaries that were more than football field in length, because they're dealing with fertility of grain, fertility of other kinds of goods were going out in huge trades, and there were caravan routes going those thousands of miles between India and not just a Mesopotamia, Sargon's whole Fertile Crescent civilization spread from the Indus to the island of Cyprus. So you had everything from India into the Mediterranean, and if you got as far as Cyprus, you were just one ship away from Crete and the Aegean. So that Greece and India, some 4,400 years ago, had a synergy, widespread. And not just that India of the northwest, but all down to the Bay of Bengal. So that you had a wave of civilization even then that went from the Irish Sea to the Bay of Bengal. In its comprehensiveness, she has brought back the fact that there was no Aryan invasion. There were instead a very sophisticated quality of literate, able to write persons who came originally from Central Asia. They came from around, originally from where Samarkand is. And for them, their great river was the Amu Darya, sometimes in British Empire called the Oxus. Arnold Toynbee has a wonderful travel book of a world great historian, from the Jumna in India to the Oxus in Central Asia, because this is the spread of Alexander the Great, who in 330 BC recognized in his vision, a vision that was first seeded to him by his tutor, Aristotle, that Aristotle had learned over 20 years of studying with Plato. Plato had learned over his years of studying with Socrates, who had learned from his years of studying with Diotima of Mantinea, a woman, who showed him that love is the real out of which the energy of time and the integral of space occurs, as love has a reality in beauty. Something which Plotinus eloquently, some 600 years after Alexander's founding of Alexandria, was able to still make quite discursively rare in language, eloquent but nevertheless there. You can read Plotinus on beauty. All of us have read it for 1,700 years. But we go back not only to Alexandria, now we go all the way back to when Black India, discovered now by Black Indian women, was exactly this interesting kind of interplay. In geology, there's a process where the intrusion of something into a matrix gets the interface blends, and this is how rare minerals are made. So that in a place like India, and there are other places like it, there are rare minerals that are made that give the body politic a different scalar out of which they can compose. A new standard of health. And in the same time that Malati is doing this, and Amika Roy is doing the investigation of the great Amaravati Stupa. This is a model that is made now in the museum that is there at Amaravati. And this is volume 1. The other volume 2 is here. And published in 1994, about the same time that Malati was beginning to publish her great books. And it's interesting because Amaravati, the original stupa, the original site, like so many different original sites in India, were founded by another Black Indian whose father was a contemporary of Alexander the Great. His name was Chandragupta, and he was a masterful general. He founded the Mauryan dynasty, Mauryan. And it was Chandragupta Maurya who paraded his elephant tanks on the other side of the several miles wide Ganges River and showed Alexander that he had sophisticated platooning of his troops and that his infantry was not just on horses, they were on elephants. And that he was welcome to try to swim his troops or row his troops across the Ganges. They will be met wherever they choose to cross. And Alexander's men refused to go on. An unheard of thing. Because there is no way that they could win that. The vision was right. The vision was true. And the vision has been true, has been right all this time. But the decision not to fight crossing the Ganges was the right one. So Chandragupta, respecting Alexander, respecting not only Alexander but his vision, and more than being able to deploy his troops in a kind of a Greek phalanx mobile power, he was able to pass on his vision, but it wasn't received by any of his sons except one. And all the other sons were after power militarily, politically, empire, dynasty. It's ours. India's ours. And we're going to extend it. It goes all the way into what we call today Afghanistan, and we're going into what we call today Indochina, and we're it. Internecine wars killed all of them off and left the runt of the pack. Not that he was small, but because he was a mulatto. He had the gold eyes and speckled skin, woolly hair, that cognated to these empire builders as he's like just a native. Well, that native's name was Ashoka. And he showed himself to be the most superior general of his era. He's a contemporary of Ptolemy, who was the superior general after Alexander, who took the prize when all the other generals wanted this area, this district, that province, this, that. He said, I'm going to build Alexander's city, Alexandria, and all of Egypt is mine, which meant not just Egypt, but all of that whole stretch of North Africa, Libya, and so forth. He's the one that commandeered the body of Alexander, sent trained cohorts to fetch the body, to put it into a glass and gold coffin, a huge entourage, carriage, plumed horses, and brought it all the way back and put it in the center of what he was building, the city, where the two great boulevards crossed. Boulevards 10 chariots wide. And all the buildings on those boulevards had to be of white marble. The boulevards were of white marble, so it was said that in the moonlight one could read codexes, if there were codexes, but the scrolls, in the moonlight, because the city shone. So it was a city of light. It was that classic Alexandria. And right at the center, on the northwest corner, is where the Soma, meaning the body, the temple of the body, and Alexander the Great's body was disclosed publicly. Everyone could see this is all real. It's there. When Augustus Caesar took over, having defeated Mark Antony, shamed him into wanting to throw himself into a suicide charge, and they obliged him. Wanted to keep Cleopatra alive as his trophy, to take her back to his great triumph in Rome and show her off in chains. But to gloat, he pushed everyone out of the Soma and left himself there for a night to absorb the energy of the body of Alexandria. He had the glass of the coffin raised so that alone he reached down to see, is this so, and touched the nose of the mummified Alexander and broke the tip. The finger that then pointed to the rest of the world and said, I'm not the big tyrant. All I am is the first. So what I'm setting up is not so much an empire, but a principiate, a principate. I'm the first person. So when it comes to speaking out of what we should do, I am the first who speaks, and the rest of you can choose to speak as you like after you have heard me. When Napoleon came to power, he called himself first citizen. A real dictator doesn't claim power, he demands it in terms of obedience. This is the way it is. What are you going to do about it? Do you want to live? That's how it works. That's where we are now. The vying for those who want to say, we control the genome, we control the finances, we have all the military might. You can choose whatever you want to do, but it's important for you to recognize that this is the way it is. This is not the way it is. It never has been. It never will be. Amaravati was built by a black Indian. His name was Nagarjuna. He was the greatest philosopher of his whole era. He also built a site on the same river, the Krishna River, one of the great rivers of South India. The Krishna weaves its way all the way into almost to the mountain range that's by the western mountain ranges of India. The other river, the Godavari, is even longer and stretches all the way up almost to above where Bombay, now called by a different name. And when the Krishna River has this big, huge bend in it with about 50 miles in between, Amaravati is on the south side of the river in one place, and all the way around that horseshoe bend in another is where Nagarjuna set up his ashram. And both places were because they were ancient sites that Ashoka had originally seeded. The earliest Amaravati stupa was a little stupa. A stupa is a bell-shaped architecture that commemorates a vestige of the Buddha. The Temple of the Tooth in Ceylon is because one of Buddha's teeth survived, and it's there in Sri Lanka, the Temple of the Tooth up near the central sacred area in the island. The same at what became Nagarjuna Khanda. Khanda in that dialect there is hill, the hill of Nagarjuna. Because like the greatest philosopher in ancient Egypt, who was also a doctor and an architect, his name was Imhotep, we've talked about him, who built the first pyramids for Zoser, third pharaoh in the Old Kingdom. Nagarjuna was on that caliber, only a greater philosopher, a greater architect, in the sense that as the pyramids reached an apex in Nagarjuna's architecture, expanded the original seeds. Ashoka's Amaravati dome was actually not very large, and it was heralded because, as Ashoka would do, he built a pillar. They're called the lion pillars. There are 4 lines lines for each of the 4 directions, but lines for each of the pairs of that square become 3-dimensional, become the cube in a differential extension. It isn't a cube in a closed integral geometry. It's a cube because it goes in the 4 directions indefinitely, because it's a harmonic based on resonance. And anyone within that resonance who keeps their pair of pairs will find that 3rd pair of the tuning fork of that resonance to make real and make viable and make living as a presence whatever it is that they are consciously bringing into play. So that it is incumbent for the 21st century to begin to understand that when you come to the ABCs, the 1, 2, 3s of physics, of astrophysics, of particle physics, you have to begin to understand that quantum field theory is concerned with quantum fluctuations. Where are the quantum fluctuations? They are in the energy, the vacuum. They're the energy in the vacuum. How can a vacuum have fluctuations? How can they have quantum fluctuations that translates into gravity? That's where gravity comes from. It comes from dark matter having dark energy course through it, bringing the dark matter into spatiality as space, so that space itself blossoms out of time, so that the fluctuations are due to time. They're due to time energy, which spontaneously emerges and occurs, and spontaneously absorbs and doesn't occur so many times per whatever time unit you want to have. Do you want to have nanoseconds? Do you want to have picoseconds? Will you settle for femtoseconds or attoseconds? How fine do you want to grind? Vibration is quite real. A harmonic is the way in which resonant sets have integrals and also at the same time differentials. So that current quantum field theory, a la, say, Alan Gust's expanding universe, is said to have repulsive gravity, repulsive gravitation. Correction. Poetic, that's bad usage. It's differential. It is a differential rather than a repulsion gravitation. And the differential gravitation is the free form play in a fertile vacuum that is real. More next week.